Hey folks, good day, art appreciation. Today we're going to be getting into art history. We're going to talk about the beginnings of art history, specifically looking into the Paleolithic, and then moving into the Neolithic, and then into the Bronze Age in Mesopotamia in particular, which is modern-day Iraq in the Middle East. With Paleolithic, essentially we're looking at groups of folks that are hunters and gatherers. So they're always on the move, following the migration of the animals, as well as gathering fruits and berries in relation to the time of the year or the seasons. So with Paleolithic, it's really essential, of course, to have food sources to survive. And so once you have your food source and your bellies are full and your family is not hungry, then there's time to essentially make art. It's hard to make art when you're hungry, when you're starving, when you're malnourished. And so at this time, which we're looking at 40,000 years ago, groups were not settled in one area. So they were always on the move, requiring lots of nutrition, not lots of calories all the time. All right. So what was primary was, of course, filling the belly, and then after filling the belly, there was time to make art. All right. So that's a Paleolithic summary. We'll look at a couple pieces in particular throughout the Paleolithic. And then Neolithic is when agriculture became revolutionized. So this is when groups stopped moving around on the hunt and in the gathering, and they started planting. They started planting seeds. They started growing crops, fruit, or not fruit. They started growing vegetation, vegetables. And in that, they were able to settle down a little more easily, in that they relied on the elements in the season and the time of year to allow for production of food, vegetation in particular. So there was even more time to make art. Okay, so we will see from the Paleolithic up into how far we get into art history that there's more and more time to develop art and to create art, because there's more amenities and productive aspects of civilization that develop, that allow folks to spend more time on their thinking and reasoning, as well as creativity. And the desire to create is human nature. It's embedded in our psyche, and whenever you get all the primordial, basic elements out of the way, there's more time to consider these options. And of course, as we get into art history, we'll start to see that there will be trying times in society and throughout the world that will help augment art as well, and give it a different platform to discuss and to create. So we'll get into all that specifically. All right. So we see already right away with Neolithic and Paleolithic, or Paleolithic first and then Neolithic second, a transition of more art being made, more complex designs starting to develop, more sense of symmetry, geometry, kind of control, and a desire for balance and order starting to develop. I mean, we're talking about a 20,000 year difference in some cases between the two. So that's a long time. But whenever it comes to our art history, what we know is the first transitioning of Paleolithic to Neolithic, and how much things changed dramatically just by groups becoming settled, not fully civilized. Civilization requires pretty much 4 main elements, and we'll see that in the next stage after Neolithic, which is the Bronze Age in Mesopotamia, which means the land between 2 rivers. And this is, in particular, is what's called the Fertile Crescent, which again is modern-day Iraq and Iran and Syria. And it's the land that's in between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, right? So that's what Mesopotamia means. Meso means rivers, and Potamia means land. So we're looking at two different rivers and the fertile soils that are in between those 2 different rivers, Tigris and Euphrates. All right, so that's Mesopotamian, and in particular, we're looking at the Sumerian. And this is a time when civilization starts to develop, all right? And civilization that is developing requires really what art history shows us is 4 main elements, and that is a heavy focus on agriculture as well as animal husbandry, animal gathering, so to speak. I guess ranching would be one way to describe it. And then also having occupational specializations. So within the civilization or within the direct society, there are special tasks and occupations that are held within what are called city-states. And these occupational specializations are part of what we start to see in civilization. For example, in our civilization today, there are certain governmental departments, specializations that are required to govern the civilization. So these are some of the onsets or beginnings of these specialized occupations. And then the 2 other is writing. So we're starting to document in writing, historically, writing and gathering information in written format, versus in Paleolithic and Neolithic documentation of history has been via the medium of clay in particular in Neolithic and stone in particular in Paleolithic. All right, so again, pottery in Neolithic for documentation, and then stone in stone as in directly the stone form itself in the round, and then also any particular design or decoration applied upon the stone or coming from the stone in the Paleolithic period. And then the last is bronze, right? The use of bronze, learning how to take a precious metal from the earth and be able to cast with it, all right? And a casting, if you remember in the sculpture PowerPoint, is when we have what's called a substitution process, and that in particular we looked at the lost wax process. So the lost wax process is heavily used in the Bronze Age in Mesopotamia and Sumerian culture, where you make something out of wax and then you essentially bury it in a pit of sand, and then you pour with air vents attached, and then you pour the molten bronze into that positive space, and it melts the positive wax. And then as it melts the positive wax, the positive bronze takes its place. It substitutes the wax, all right? So the wax is substituted with the bronze. So that becomes heavily used in civilization in Mesopotamian and Sumerian culture. Okay. So let's go back to Mesopotamia. Let's go back to Paleolithic. And there's a great map on your PowerPoint that shows you the early centers of Paleolithic and civilization that kind of move throughout the whole entire globe, the whole entire world, and shows you Paleolithic, Neolithic, and Mesopotamian Bronze Age areas as well. So from Paleolithic to civilization. And also part of this PowerPoint is Egypt, but we're going to talk about Egypt on its own in another video because it's fairly in-depth. We might combine a little bit of the Sumerian with the Bronze Age that we're talking about now with Egypt, just to kind of give a parallel of the two because they're so close to one another. But with Paleolithic, in your PowerPoint, just look back and you can see that even some of the numbers date back 2 million years in stone with stone cutting tools. So that's really quite amazing, really. But the use of tools is the first artisan process. All right, so needing tools, and why would you need those tools? Those tools are to help build rudimentary structures temporarily if you're a hunting and gathering group, as well as if you're hunting. You know, rudimentary tools obviously will pierce the animal, will be able to bludgeon the animal if you're in the search for animals, right? So again, the Paleolithic art is showing that the earliest findings are 40,000 years ago, and there's a great piece of, well, of course, the debate is still open because, you know, it's just so far back we don't know. There's histories of civilization developing far earlier in places in India in particular now with some of the research that is being shown, even stretching back beyond the Paleolithic period. But there's a great image of an engraved piece of ochre, which is an oxide, all right, which is a piece of petrified oxide over 77,000 years ago. And when you look at that, you can see that there's starting to be this abstract pattern. And this abstract pattern is kind of geometric in nature. And so, again, whenever you have finished the hunt for the day and you've gathered enough berries, there's time to sit down at night by the fire and start whittling a little bit. Except we're not talking about wood, we're talking about ochre or stone, or petrified oxide in this case, in South Africa. So there's a desire to take that time and create, all right, even if it's very superficial, it's very rudimentary, and it's not very enhanced, there's still a desire to create. And then if we look at a little further along the woman of Wildendorf as well as the Hohlefels figure, you can see that we're starting to see human figures in the round being developed. And some call these fertility goddesses. Some say that this may be religious art. So again, we're looking at arts functioning as worship for religiosity and for spiritual advancement. So there is that debate, and the reason that there is that debate is the desire to see these figures as fertility figures, and if they're fertility figures, then there are certain parts of the body that are abstracted to emphasize fertility, hence the breast as well as the vaginal area of both of these figures. And so if a hunting and gathering group has a need for greater food sources and increasing their tribe, so to speak, their group, the more fertility they have on the earth, the more fertility that there is within the animal kingdom, the more fertility there is within their own group, increasing the numbers, making the hunt greater and stronger, and having more warriors, or not warriors, more hunters available, more gatherers available. Then we start to see the development of we start to see the development of groups getting greater, and then that transitions into the Neolithic, where we have larger villages of population. All right. So the fertility goddess was carried on them. They were very small. All right. You can see that the Hohlefels figure is only 2.5 inches tall, so it's very, very small. So you don't want anything big and cumbersome when you're a hunter and a gatherer. You want to be able to put something into your satchel or under your belt or whatever you're wearing, and keep it on you as momentum, all right, kind of religious and transcendental and environmental momentum. So by having these fertility figures, it makes the hunt more fertile, it makes the gathering more fertile, it makes the group more fertile, it makes the earth more fertile. Just overall, it has an element of fertility, all right? Hence the emphasis on certain parts of the figure. All right. Then there's an interest in painting. So going into some of these caves that we see in south of France, and you won't see a lot of human depictions of depictions in these cave paintings. It's mostly what they see, right? So they're on the hunt, and so what are they doing? Or the animals that are around them, they're depicting them, they're portraying them, all right, on these stone walls, and they're using oxides, right? So in the Chauvet cave in France, which is more recent and it's better preserved, they're wall paintings of animals. And they're painted with charcoals and earthen pigments. Those earthen pigments are called oxides. One in particular is called red iron oxide. And then also ochre, yellow ochre, which goes back to that ochre piece that was carved into. These pieces of ochre were kind of, and iron oxide were kind of used like paints, watered down and then brushed on, and then also kind of like chalks, drawn on like chalks if they were hard and petrified. Right? So there was a desire at the end of the day, or at some point in the day, to go and paint, all right, and to draw. So you can see with the images of these caves that there's an interest in showing depth and overlap, spatial depth, implied spatial depth, with animals overlapping one another, a sense of motion of an animal that might be in motion by depicting it 4 times, as if it's in moving away from the individual. Animals fighting. I mean, there's narration starting to develop, storytelling starting to develop, storytelling via visual arts versus just oral spoken history. All right. And then also there's the petroglyphs. All right, the petroglyphs is essentially going in upon an exposed piece of stone and carving directly on the surface of the stone, or carving into the stone. All right, and creating narratives. And with our petroglyphs, we start to see humans and figures that resemble humans, I should say. Figures that resemble humans. They're abstract, they're geometric in nature. They have very symbolic garments on that almost speak to like flags or certain indicators of that tribe in that area. There might have been certain symbols that were used for each group that indicated who they are. So whenever you would scratch or peck into the stone and you would leave these symbolic garments on these resembled geometric like figures, when someone would approach it that wasn't part of that group, they would know, oh, this is maybe this territory where this group is, or that there is a group here and this is their territory, and this is where they roam, and then these are the garments that they wear. So there's starting to be a high degree of detail whenever it comes to these petroglyphs. Right? And then we move into the Neolithic. And again, the Neolithic is a time when agriculture is revolutionized. So we're looking at planting seeds and vegetation, like I mentioned before. And this is where we really start to see the use of geometric abstract shapes and also images reflecting the shifts in living patterns. All right. So if you think about it, if you're plotting out land for agriculture, it's a very geometric process. Okay, so the way the beds are lined up, the way everything's irrigated, the use of water, all of the land becomes kind of geometric. And if that's your focus mentally, those geometric patterns are going to start to reflect on the surface of your art. And in particular, we're looking at pottery. All right. There's also motifs derived from plant and animal forms. So if we look at the earthenware beaker coming from Susa, Iran, you can see that there's very geometric patterns on the very top of this piece and throughout the side, kind of framing these animal-like shapes, almost like this ram shape in the center of the terracotta painted pot. And those geometric patterns on the top are almost like wheat, right? Like in a wheat field. And then there's this patterning, this geometric patterning showing this display of order and control. And then within it is this animal form that is abstracted, okay? So kind of depicting what is going on in the environment around them. Everything is becoming quartered off. Everything is becoming regionalized, so to speak, for agriculture, as well as starting to hunt the animals and gather the animals in certain areas as we move towards civilization that we see in the Bronze Age. Also happening in China, you can look at the burial urn from Gansu province. Bold interlocking design, designed probably from bottom of the shells. Okay, so you can see the use of kind of the aquatic element that is included in this pottery coming from China. All right. So this pottery is used to hold the grains, right, after it's been harvested. It's also used to gather water, to bring water to the fields. So pottery is being used as a container, a utilitarian container, to help the growth of the Neolithic period, mostly agricultural villages and tribes. All right, we're not quite into civilization yet because we're not incorporating writing and the use of bronze, and also occupational specializations. We have agricultural and animal husbandry starting, but the other three have yet to really develop. Okay, still very primitive, but still becoming very sophisticated. Primitive just means that lack of technology, and technologies develop as civilization starts to unfold, which we see in the Bronze Age, in Mesopotamia. So we move into that part of the PowerPoint. There's a little summary of what Mesopotamia is. We're not going to talk about Egypt yet. We'll get into that later. We're going to discuss kind of Mesopotamia and Egypt at the same time. But there's a great map, figure 1512, that shows you where Mesopotamia is and how close it is to Egypt. All right. Again, there's a little information about the city-states, and then in particular talking about a hierarchy of natural gods, and that they build these temple structures called ziggurats, and there's one in particular called the Sacred Mountain. And these ziggurats are supposed to be a place of not just worship, but a connection to the nature, the natural gods that also reside within heaven and that of earth. So we're starting to see a connection between that of the heavenly realms and then that of the earthly realms. So religiosity is starting to develop with this sense of duality, where there is the upper realm of existence and then there is the earthly realm of existence. All right. Again, this is kind of this is pre-Christianity by far, but we're starting to see an interest in worshiping beyond the earthly realm. Okay, versus Paleolithic and Neolithic. There's very much what would be considered a pagan mentality, where it's focused on the environment or on Earth itself. So now we're looking beyond the Earth and into more of a spiritual realm. All right, the ziggurat is made of sun-baked bricks. So we're talking about casting again, where they're putting the clay into a certain mold and then pulling the clay out of the mold and allowing it to set up and create these bricks, and then it creates this dry masonry, which we talked about in the architecture section. All right. So building is starting to happen. Lots of agriculture is starting to build. So look at the ziggurat of Namu in Iraq. Again, this is a place of worship and a place of where the earthly activities can meet in a form of ritual or art functioning as worship with the heavenly realms. All right. And then also take a look at the vase from Warka. All right, this is a really great example of narrative relief sculpture. And again, it's a celebration of fertility. Fertility is very essential whenever you're trying to build your civilization, because at this point, you're looking at increasing the population to make your civilization strong versus other civilizations that are developing at this time. So the more bodies you have, the stronger the population you have, the greater chance of growth internally as well as defense externally, right? And within the vase from Warka, it depicts humans in harmony with the natural world. So again, it's not a separation from the natural world, it's a synthesis of the natural earthly world and its relation with the heavenly body as well. So we're looking at, again, an emphasis and an appreciation of where these civilizations have come from, or being heavily agricultural in the Neolithic, and then hunting and gathering in the Paleolithic. So it's evolution of civilization, so to speak. So the relief depiction, if you remember looking back at the sculpture PowerPoint, it's low relief. So low relief is also known as bas relief, BAS. And I'm looking over here because this lady just keeps circling in the same spot in the parking lot like 20 times. It's like there's 1,000 parking spaces available. That was kind of funny. Anyway, so low relief is this bas relief, which is where just a little bit of the definition of the form is exposed, versus high relief would be where you're looking at 2/3 to 3/4 of the circumference of the form being revealed from the background. Okay, so take a look at that. Take a look at that, the base, the Warka base, right, from Iraq. And again, in the Sumerian, the cultures flourished among independent city-states. So they had their own little developments, their own little groups called city-states, and within these city-states, it'd be kind of like we have governors, right, for each state in America, and then we have a president. And is kind of similar to that. Each city-state had its own functioning government. But they were all under the rule of one, and that was the king, all right? And it was Akradian, the Akradian king, all right? So the king oversaw all the city-states. The city-states functioned as individuals, but they also functioned as a whole underneath the king. And that was around 2300 BCE. BCE means before Common Era. It used to be BC, which would be before Christ, and now it's called BCE, before Common Era. I hope this lady finds a parking spot. She's really trying hard. Anyway, so there's a great image of the lost wax cast of his head, all right? And you'll see that the eyes are missing. That's because the eyes were probably made of a very precious material, maybe a gold. Or it's possible that if it was made of a precious material, that it was stolen and taken and sold. Or the opposite, it could have been, the eyes could have been made of something that has deteriorated over the years, that no longer is preserved. Versus the bronze, you can see, if you want to document history and you want to do it sculpturally, you're going to use metal, you're going to use bronze, or you're going to use clay. You're going to use something that become stone-like, all right? With clay, it's vitrification. With bronze, it becomes solid, all right? And congeals and becomes dense. So this bronze head of Akkadian ruler, Nineveh, is preserved this long, and it will be preserved again for another 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 plus years. It will patina. It will maybe get a little oxidation on the surface, but the form will remain. So if you want to document for future civilizations to recognize who you are, this is the way to do it. This is why the bronze casting became part of what we know as modern day civilization, for documentation purposes, to show who was in rule, to show who was in power, to show what the civilization was doing and how it was progressing. Right? We started to see this a little bit in the petroglyphs in the Neolithic, and now we see it even more so in the round, freestanding, in the Bronze Age with the Sumerian head of Akkadian ruler, right? Made out of bronze. But with this, I want you to focus on, and I'll leave this video off. I'll turn it off. Is start looking at the geometric patterns of the beard, of the arrangements of the headdress, the placement of the smile, and all of that, because we're going to refer to this again whenever we start talking about the Egyptian section. All right. So take a look at this. There will be some assessment questions that I would like you to answer and be due next week. So take a look at this video as well as the previous videos, the architecture video, the craft media video, and I'll be formulating some questions for you. Okay? Take good care, and I'll be seeing you, talking with you all next week, or presenting things for you next week. Okay, bye.